You ignite the dynamite and run. The explosion shatters the solid rock of the cave. As the thick dust clears, you shine your flashlight into the newly opened cavity. Sitting completely cross-legged on a small stone ledge is a tiny figure. It is only 14 inches tall, but it isn't a carved statue. It has wrinkled skin, fingernail, and a flat skull. What was sealed inside the mountain? The San Pedro Mountains in Wyoming are harsh and completely isolated. They are a rugged, dangerous stretch of terrain that forgives very few mistakes. In October of 1932, two prospectors named Cecil Main and Frank Carr were searching the canyons for gold. They were working deep inside a narrow, dried-up gulch. The heavy granite rock face was incredibly thick, completely blocking their path deeper into the mountain. They believed a rich vein of gold was hiding just behind the stone. They drilled deep holes directly into the solid rock wall. They packed the holes with heavy dynamite, lit the fuse, and took cover behind the rubble. The explosion was absolutely deafening. It tore down the heavy wall, exposing a hidden, sealed cavern behind the rock. The air inside the dark space was completely stale, trapped inside the mountain for God knows how long. The miners stepped through the smoking rubble with their heavy flashlights. They expected to see a glittering vein of gold. Instead, the narrow beam of light hit a small flat ledge jutting out from the cave wall. Sitting quietly on that ledge was a perfectly preserved miniature humanoid. It was sitting completely upright, its tiny arms resting quietly on its crossed legs. The entire figure was barely 14 inches tall. If it stood up, it would barely reach a grown man's knee. The miners slowly approached the ledge, initially thinking it was an old children's doll left behind in the dirt. But as they got closer, the physical details completely shattered that theory. The figure was heavily covered in dark, leathery skin. It had a flat, highly unnatural skull shape. Its eyes bulged heavily from the sockets, permanently closed and dried by the arid cave air. It had a full, visible set of teeth. It even had tiny, perfectly formed fingernails on its miniature hands. It was not a toy. It was a dried, completely mummified body. But the physical geometry of the corpse defied every known law of human biology. A 14-inch body is roughly the size of a premature infant. But this figure did not have the soft, unformed features of a human baby. It looked like an incredibly old, weathered man. Its face was deeply wrinkled, and its physical proportions were entirely wrong for an infant. The miners carefully wrapped the fragile figure in a thick blanket. They carried it down the mountain and brought it back to the local town of Casper. They named them Pedro. When they showed the body to the locals, the reaction was immediate, entirely skeptical. People assumed it was a massive, elaborate hoax. During the 1930s, traveling carnival sideshows often created fake monsters using animal bone and dried leather. They called these fakes gaffs. The townspeople believed Pedro was just a clever fraud designed to make a quick dollar from gullible tourists. But local Native American tribes looked at the mummy with genuine terror. The Shoshone people have lived in the Wyoming region for centuries. They have deep, highly protected oral tradition. One of their absolute oldest legends speaks of a race called the Nimerigar. According to the myth, the Nimerigar were a tribe of tiny, incredibly aggressive people. They lived entirely inside the dark, unmapped cave systems of the Rocky Mountains. They were armed with small, poisoned arrows and attacked anyone who wandered into their territory. The legend always stated a deeply brutal rule of society. When a Nimerigar became too sick or old to fight, their own people would kill them. For generations, modern historians completely dismissed the story as pure folklore. But now, tiny mummified man had just been pulled from a sealed rock wall. The physical evidence was suddenly sitting right on a wooden table in town. To prove the mummy was real, the miners allowed scientists to examine the body. Pedro was taken to a local biological laboratory. Researchers placed the small, fragile figure under a heavy medical X-ray. They fully expected the film to reveal wooden sticks, wire, and cheap animal glue. When the X-ray film was chemically developed, the entire room lay silent. The images completely destroyed the hoax. Pedro had a fully formed, completely intact skeletal structure. The X-rays clearly showed a miniature human spine, There was a perfectly detailed rib cage hidden beneath the leathery skin. There were tiny collarbones and fully formed arm and leg bones. It was entirely, undeniably biological, but the X-rays also revealed something much darker hiding beneath the surface. Pedro had not died a natural, peaceful death. The miniature skeleton showed massive, catastrophic physical trauma. His right collarbone was violently snapped in half. His fragile spine was severely damaged, and his skull had been completely shattered by a massive blunt force blow. The dark, gelatinous mass of his brain was visibly pushed to the very top of his skull cavity. He was brutally murdered. Cases like this completely unravel our understanding of biology. And if exposing impossible history is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because the scientific debate over Pedro was about to get even stranger. The medical X-rays definitively proved the mummy was a real biological entity, but scientists were entirely divided on what exactly they were looking at. The anthropological department at Harvard University eventually requested to study the remains. They examined the high-resolution X-rays and issued a highly grounded clinical diagnosis. They concluded that Pedro was not a fully grown miniature man. They believed the baby suffered from an incredibly rare medical condition known as anencephaly. This devastating condition severely halts the development of the brain and the skull during pregnancy. It causes the top of the head to appear entirely flat. The bulging eyes and the strange facial proportions perfectly matched the clinical markers of the disease. The Harvard team suggested the baby was born to an ancient Native American tribe. Because of the severe physical deformities, the infant likely died shortly after birth. The tribe then carefully placed the body deep in a dry cave. The arid, freezing mountain climate naturally mummified the remains over centuries. It is a mathematically sound, completely logical explanation. It removes the paranormal aspect and replaces it with a tragic human reality. But several other prominent doctors heavily disputed the Harvard findings. They looked at the exact same X-rays and saw completely different evidence. They pointed directly to the teeth. An anencephalic infant is born without a properly developed jawline, but Pedro had a full set of teeth, including highly pronounced canine. Teeth do not physically form like that in a newborn baby. Other medical experts pointed to the skeletal fusion in the X-rays. In a human infant, the bones are mostly soft cartilage. They have not yet fused into solid adult bone. But the X-rays of Pedro showed heavy, solid calcification. The bones looked exactly like they belonged to a mature adult. A prominent researcher claimed the skeleton belonged to someone who was at least 65 years old. The medical community was completely fractured. How can a 14-inch skeleton have the dense, fused bones of an elderly man? The physical evidence was entirely contradictory. The biology did not align with any known human developmental charts. While the scientists aggressively argued over the X-ray, the physical mummy itself was subjected to a deeply morbid fate. Pedro was not given a quiet resting place in a museum. He was treated exclusively as a financial asset. The original miners sold them to a local business. For years, Pedro was displayed in a heavy glass case in the front window of a local drugstore. People traveled from across the state just to stare at the tiny body. He was eventually purchased by a car dealer named Ivan Goodman in the late 1940s. Goodman took Pedro on a heavy promotional tour. He charged people money to look at the biological anomaly. The mummy became a cheap, traveling sideshow attraction. But Ivan Goodman eventually fell deeply ill. Before he died in 1950, he passed the mummy on to a mysterious businessman from New York named Leonard Wadler. Wadler took possession of the small glass case, and then he completely vanished. Leonard Wadler took Pedro away from Wyoming. He never placed the mummy in a public museum. He never submitted the body for modern DNA testing. He simply disappeared. The only physical evidence of the anomaly. The San Pedro mummy has not been seen in public for over 70 years. His current location is entirely unknown. He could be sitting in a private collection in a locked, climate-controlled basement. He could have been destroyed decades ago. Without the physical body, modern science is completely paralyzed. We cannot extract a tiny DNA sample to definitively prove if Pedro was an infant with a tragic defect or something completely unknown to history. The only physical evidence that remains today are the original grainy X-ray photographs from the 1930s. For decades, the disappearance of Pedro seemed to be the absolute end of the story. It was written off as a bizarre lost piece of American folklore. But then, something completely unexpected happened. A second miniature mummy was suddenly discovered. Deep in the dusty archives of a local university, researchers found another tiny body. It was a female mummy, entirely similar to Pedro. She was also found in a cave in the exact same Wyoming mountain range. They called her Chiquita. Had the exact same leathery skin. She had the same unnatural skull shape and incredibly small proportions. She was also heavily mummified by the dry air. Modern researchers were finally able to run advanced scans on Chiquita. The modern DNA testing on the second mummy confirmed the tragic grounded theory. Chiquita was indeed a human infant born with anencephaly. The genetic markers proved she was a Native American baby who died shortly after birth. The mystery of the second mummy was cleanly and undeniably solved by modern science. But solving Chiquita does not completely solve Pedro. The X-rays of the two mummies do not perfectly match. Chiquita's skeleton looks exactly like a fragile infant. Pedro's X-rays still show the fused, heavy bones of an adult. He still has the full set of teeth. He still has the violently shattered skull and the broken collarbone. If Pedro was just a sick, fragile infant, why was his skeleton severely crushed? Why was he found sitting completely upright, entirely sealed behind thick, solid granite? A grieving tribe does not dynamite a massive rock wall to bury a child. They do not violently smash a baby's skull. The details of his discovery absolutely refuse to align with the clinical diagnosis. There are simply too many missing pieces in the rock. The local Shoshone legends still whisper about the tiny people in the dark. They believe the isolated caves are still occupied. They believe the mountain simply hides what it wants to hide. They blasted the wall open. They took the X-ray photographs, but the man in the rock never came back.